Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Philosophizing with a Hammer. First off, I want to say a huge thank you to all of you for the incredible support you have shown over the last few episodes. Your enthusiasm definitely means the world to me, and it is what keeps this podcast alive. If this is your first time tuning in, welcome. I'm glad you're here, so be sure to hit that follow button so you don't miss any future episodes. If you enjoy the content so far, I'd be immensely grateful if you could take a moment to rate it. Your ratings not only help me, but it also make it easier for other users to discover the podcast on their platform and join our journey into the fascinating world of unveiling ancient wisdom and applying it in our world. So, over the last few episodes, we have been doing this journey, analyzing Nietzsche's works and applying them in our current world. And today, we're going to continue our series about that, and we're going to dig into his concepts of the master and the slave morality, as you might have noticed already from the title. So, I'd like to say a few words about the previous episodes. We have talked about the will to power, the death of God, the Übermensch, the eternal recurrence, how everything is actually related in Nietzsche's works, and each idea is just a stepping stone to the other. If you haven't listened to those episodes yet, I really recommend checking them out before listening to this one. So let's dig deep into it, the master and the slave. To begin with, I would say that we must consider the historical context in which Nietzsche wrote. Nietzsche viewed morality not as something universal, but as a construct shaped by power dynamics. He divided it into two instinct systems. He calls them the master morality and the slave morality. So, the master morality originates from the ruling class, those who held power like the aristocrats or warriors of the ancient societies. For the masters, good reflects their own qualities, in which we talk about strength, courage, ambition, independence, and creativity. They determine morality affirmatively, based on what enhances life and power. For them, bad is merely the absence of these traits, which is defined in weakness, passivity, or dependence. Now, on the other hand, we have slave morality, which is contrast to the master morality. Slave morality emerges from the oppressed, those without power. It is reactive by nature, born out of what Nietzsche calls ressentiment, which is the resentment, a deep-seated resentment toward the ruling class. So the slaves, unable to express power directly, they invert the values of the masters. Traits like humility, empathy, and meekness, previously seen as weak, become virtues, while the strength and pride of the masters are condemned as evil. This moral inversion is basically central to Nietzsche's argument about how morality evolves through history. Let's consider this quote by Nietzsche, and I quote, "It was the Jews who, with awe-inspiring consistency, dared to invert the aristocratic value equation, saying the wretched alone are the good, the poor, impotent, lowly are the good." End of quote. This is taken from the first essay on the genealogy of morality. Now, I know at first glance this statement may appear inflammatory. However, Nietzsche isn't making any criticism against Jewish people. Instead, he is recognizing their historical role in a profound moral shift. As an oppressed group in antiquity, the Jewish people redefined values in response to their subjugation. This was not a critique of Judaism again, but let's say it was rather an observation of how moral systems evolve under oppression. In the previous episode, we talked about how Nietzsche's ideas, when misinterpreted, they can often lead to chaotic results. Most tragically done by Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. Now, I don't know if Hitler was trying to quote Nietzsche and he was falsifying the arguments and the interpretation, or he was too stupid to understand the guy. Well, either way, Nietzsche was never an anti-Semite. So Nietzsche's recognition of this moral inversion was never intended as an attack. Instead, he described the transformation as both ingenious and resilient, even using the terms like awe-inspiring consistency. I advise you to have a look at the previous episode called The Übermensch, in which we talked a little bit more about how Nietzsche's ideas were misinterpreted by Hitler, and this one is no different. You see, Hitler's selective reading distorted Nietzsche's philosophy, ignoring Nietzsche's explicit disdain for nationalism and anti-Semitism. In fact, Nietzsche criticized German nationalism as a form of herd mentality and celebrated diversity and individuality. Again, if you want a deeper exploration of how Nietzsche's philosophy was misunderstood, particularly by Hitler, I encourage you to listen to the Übermensch, the previous episode. There we dive into how Nietzsche's ideals of individual transcendence were perverted into a justification for oppression and hatred. Nietzsche's ideas go beyond simply categorizing two kinds of morality. He's encouraging us to look at how they shape culture, how they shape individuals, and even modern society. And to fully grasp the concept of master and slave morality, we need to delve into their origins and understand how Nietzsche drew inspiration, whether directly or in contrast, from earlier thinkers like Hegel. Now, Nietzsche's ideas did not merge in a vacuum. They were responses to the intellectual currents of his time. And when we look at the master and slave morality, Nietzsche introduces the concepts in The Genealogy of Morality, the book in which we read the previous quote from. These moral frameworks, he suggests, they stem from historical power dynamics. You see, master morality arises from the ruling classes, the warriors, the nobles, and conquerors of history, the Übermensch, figures like Beethoven, like Napoleon, in which we have talked about in the last episode. It is characterized by strength, by self-confidence, and the affirmation of life. For these individuals, what is good aligns with their own qualities, which is power, vitality, and excellence. Slave morality, on the flip side, emerges as a reaction to oppression. Nietzsche theorizes that he oppressed classes, like the slaves and the weak. By the way, he calls them slaves not in the literal sense, but as a metaphor. These people, they were unable to express their will to power directly through strength or conquest. Instead, they redefined good as qualities that suited their condition. Humility, meekness, and patience, basically. This morality, Nietzsche argues, is inherently reactive. It was built upon the resentment toward the masters, rather than an affirmation of life. So, while Nietzsche often positioned himself as a critic of Hegel, there are undeniable connections between their ideas. You see, Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, one of the hardest books I've ever read, offers a concept strikingly similar to Nietzsche's dichotomy, which is the master and the slave dialectic. So, in Hegel's framework, the dynamic, it unfolds as a struggle for recognition. The master dominates the slave, but becomes dependent on the slave's recognition for self-worth. Meanwhile, the slave, through labor and introspection, gains a deeper understanding of the world and eventually a form of inner freedom. You see, Nietzsche seems to have taken this dialectic and transformed it, whereas Hegel saw the master-slave relationship as a step toward mutual recognition and the evolution of self-consciousness. Nietzsche rejected the notion of reconciliation or synthesis because for him, the conflict between the master and the slave morality isn't a staged in a grand historical process. It is a fundamental and an ongoing struggle between two opposing value systems. So, Hegel's slave achieves liberation through labor and thought, but Nietzsche's slave morality remains trapped in resentment. Here lies Nietzsche's critique, which is slave morality rooted in resentment doesn't lead to growth or transcendence. Instead, it perpetuates a cycle of negation, defining itself solely in opposing the master. This resentment, let's call it a resentment driven morality, has shaped much of Western culture, according to Nietzsche, particularly through religious and democratic values that prioritize equality and compassion. And while Hegel's dialectic emphasizes progression towards an eventual synthesis and reconciliation, Nietzsche dismisses the idea as overly optimistic. He sees no harmonious resolution between master and slave morality. Instead, he challenges individuals to rise above both frameworks, which is transcending resentment and embodying the Übermensch. The historical and philosophical context deepens our understanding of Nietzsche's slave and master morality. And by reinterpreting and diverging from Hegel, Nietzsche created a framework that challenges us to question not only the origins of our values, but also how they continue to influence the moral fabric of our society today. So, let's dive a little bit deeper into Nietzsche's analysis of master and slave morality. Let's look at it bluntly. So, Nietzsche's ideas here go simply beyond categorizing two kinds of moralities, that is, the master and the slave. He's encouraging us to look at how they shape culture, how they shape individuals, and how they shape modern society. One of the most fundamental differences between the two moralities is their approach to value creation. This is going to bring us to talk about the creation and the reaction. So, we can look at master morality as creation, as creative. Master morality emerges from a position of strength. Imagine an aristocrat, for example, in ancient times, a warrior or a nobleman. For them, good means qualities they already embody, like strength, courage, ambition, and a zest for life. They don't define themselves by opposing others. Instead, they generate their values independently. You see, goodness is life-affirming. It's a robust. But for the slave morality, it comes as a reactive. You see, we have a morality that doesn't create values, but reacts to the values imposed by the masters. It arises in the oppressed, who redefine their lack of power as a virtue. Traits that masters see as bad, such as meekness, humility, or submission, are reframed as good, for hope. And this hope, this false hope, this moral framework, it isn't about affirming life or strength, but about opposing the powerful and justifying one's position of weakness. So, while master morality says, this is good because it is me, slave morality says, this is good because it is the opposite of them. Imagine a workplace scenario with two colleagues. Just look at it from a modern perspective. The first colleague is ambitious, confident, and excels at their job. They take pride in their achievements. They set high standards, and they aren't afraid to stand out. You see, this person defines success on their terms, creating their values based on their strengths and their contributions. And on the flip side, you have the second colleague, always feeling overshadowed, starts to resent the first, and instead of striving to improve or recognizing the other's accomplishments, they redefine what it means to be good. They aim at being humble and avoiding competition and staying unnoticed are the true virtue of a team player. In this scenario, the ambitious colleague represents the master, affirming life and their own abilities. And the resentful colleague here represents the slave, reacting to the other's strength and framing their own lack of ambition as a moral victory. This example highlights how these dynamics can unfold in everyday life, helping us see Nietzsche's ideas in action. And Nietzsche, with his critique, it doesn't stop at individuals. He argues that entire cultures and religions are built on these frameworks, and this is one of the main arguments why Nietzsche dislikes Christianity. For him, Christianity is the absolute embodiment of slave morality. And his critique is one of the most provocative aspects of his philosophy. That is his critique of Christianity, that is. So, he saw Christianity as the ultimate expression of slave morality, a system of values born out of the oppressed and the powerless. Let's break this down in depth. So, what does Christianity uphold? Christianity champions virtues like humility, which is seeing oneself as small and dependent on God's grace, meekness, which is accepting suffering without resistance, compassion, prioritizing care for the weak, for the poor, and self-denial, the most important, that is, sacrificing worldly pleasures for spiritual rewards. This aligns with an ancient philosophy, that is the philosophy of Plato, and this is actually why Nietzsche dislikes Platonism and Socratism, because of the same reason. Socrates rejects reality, rejects life because of a spiritual rewards that he believed in, which is the world of ideas. Same thing with Christianity. So these virtues align with the mindset of an oppressed group. And for the early Christians, many of whom were marginalized with the Roman Empire, these values provided solace and a way to reclaim dignity in a world that denied them power. Nietzsche saw this as a moral inversion, qualities that once symbolized weakness, poverty, submission, and suffering became spiritual strengths, while the pride and the strength of their oppressors were demonized, let's say, as sinful. One of Nietzsche's, let's say, sharpest critiques is how Christianity reinterprets suffering. Instead of viewing suffering as something to overcome or eliminate, Christianity actually finds meaning in it. Suffering becomes redemptive, a path to spiritual salvation, as seen in the crucifixion of Christ. For Nietzsche, this is dangerous because it glorifies powerlessness. And rather than seeking to overcome hardships through strength and action, Christianity sanctifies it, encouraging people to endure suffering instead of challenging the systems that cause it. Nietzsche's disdain for Christianity isn't just about theology. This might raise the question also, why does Nietzsche hate religion in general? It's tied to what he sees as religion's effect on human potential and cultural development. For him, Christianity suppresses the will to power. Religion suppresses the will to power. For Nietzsche, life is driven by the will to power. The innate drive to grow, to overcome and assert oneself, as we have seen in the previous episode. If you haven't checked it out, I really recommend you to listen to the episode on the will to power. So, the master morality aligns with the will to power. It affirms life by celebrating strength, by celebrating ambition and creation. Christianity, however, suppresses this instinct. And by encouraging humility, self-denial, submission, Christianity, let's say, reduces the individual and its greatness. It tells people to turn to the other cheek instead of fighting back, to value the next life over this one, and to see their suffering as virtuous rather than something to be conquered, to be overcome. Nietzsche believed the suppression of the will to power leads to mediocrity. It prevents humanity from reaching its highest potential. It's merely a tool of control. It's basically a political tool. He believed, that is Nietzsche, that it was used by the powerful to keep the masses obedient. Nietzsche believed that Christianity's sole purpose is to keep the masses obedient. By glorifying the submission, religion convinces people to accept their lower status. It promises an afterlife and discourages people from challenging their conditions in this life. In this sense, religion perpetuates slave morality on a scale that is societal, keeping individuals passive and dependent rather than empowering them to take control of their lives. One of Nietzsche's boldest claims also is that Christianity represents itself as a rejection of life itself. So, by focusing on the afterlife, it devalues the here and the now. By condemning natural instincts like pride, like ambition and desire, it denies the full spectrum of human experience. Nietzsche called Christianity as a nihilistic religion because it places ultimate value on something beyond life rather than embracing life in all its chaos and imperfection. But this isn't a blanket critique. It is important to note that Nietzsche isn't merely attacking Christianity for the sake of it. His critique is more about its origins and its consequences. After ranting this much about Nietzsche, as far as this goes, you might think of him as, an early teenager who's just hating on religion and just trying to be cool. No, Nietzsche was never like that. So, Nietzsche recognized that Christianity's values were born out of necessity. For an oppressed group, redefining suffering and weakness as virtues was a way to survive and find meaning. He even admired the ingenuity of this moral inversion. And the consequences, well, what truly made Nietzsche oppose was how these values become universal. This is what made Nietzsche basically dislike Christianity. The morality of the oppressed was imposed on everyone, even those who could thrive under master morality. For Nietzsche, this universalization of slave morality was a loss for humanity because it suppressed individuality and strength. To make this more relatable for today's listeners, let's think about how these ideas resonate in the modern world. Do we still glorify suffering as noble rather than addressing its root causes? How often do people avoid pursuing greatness out of fear of being labeled as arrogant or selfish? You see, Nietzsche's critique of Christianity is a call to question the values we have inherited and to ask whether they serve us as individuals and as a society. Are we affirming life or are we holding ourselves back? This segment leads us directly to the broader implications of master and slave morality in the cultural and political systems of today. And here's where Nietzsche gets a little bit provocative. He argues that even modern values like equality and democracy reflect the influence of slave morality. These systems often prioritize the collective, mediocrity, and leveling the playing field over the pursuit of individual greatness or excellence. Nietzsche wasn't necessarily anti-democratic to begin with, to clarify that out, but he worried about what happens when we suppress ambition and celebrate sameness instead of celebrating the extraordinary. In other words, he feared a world where the exceptional are dragged down to make everyone equal. And to fully grasp Nietzsche's analysis, we need to bring one of his central concepts, we need to talk again a little bit about the will to power and look at it from today's episode's perspective. So you can look at the master morality as the will to power because they both align naturally with each other. You see, master morality, it's about creating and asserting oneself and striving for greatness. It embraces life's challenges as opportunities to grow and flourish. The masters don't resent the world, they conquer it, whether through action, through art, or through philosophy. However, the slave morality can be seen as the suppression of the will to power. It suppresses the instinct of rising to the top. You see, the oppressed cannot conquer the world, so they retreat inward, finding comfort in values that reject power and self-assertion. This isn't inherently bad, but Nietzsche warns that it leads to a culture of ressentiment, the term that we talked about it earlier. A simmering resentment of those who embrace life's challenges and excel. So, we can look at the idea of master and slave morality today in the context of social media culture, for example. In today's digital world, you have social media that plays a significant role in shaping our perceptions of success and morality. Platforms often reward outrage and victimhood and moral outrage, traits, that Nietzsche would associate with slave morality. Why? Well, because these platforms amplify voices of those who feel oppressed or wronged, creating a space where complaints and grievances are shared widely. In this context, social media becomes a tool for those who feel powerless to strike back against the so-called masters of the society. On the flip side, social media also gives space for creators, for artists, for entrepreneurs, for influencers to boldly innovate and defy norms. You see, these individuals who create new realities and challenge the status quo, they embody the traits that Nietzsche associates with the master morality. They are not reacting to the world, as we have seen. No, they are shaping it according to their own values. Think of creators who use their platforms to innovate in ways that completely disrupt industries. People like Elon Musk, for example, who challenges both technological limits and societal expectations, or someone like, that host of Philosophizing with a Hammer podcast, someone like that. These individuals, whether you agree with them or not, they reflect a modern form of masters who create their own values. And just to elaborate a little bit more on the example I gave earlier about the work dynamic example, in entrepreneurial spaces, master morality thrives. Here, risk-taking, ambition, and self-reliance, and the drive to create something new are all highly celebrated. Entrepreneurs like Jeff Bezos, like Steve Jobs, or even smaller startup founders all operate with a mindset where they embrace the challenge of the unknown and seek to shape the world according to their own vision. On the other hand, in more traditional corporate environments, slave morality can emerge. These environments often prioritize conformity and passive compliance, where employees are expected to adhere to pre-established norms and regulations. The emphasis is not on personal greatness or innovation, but rather on doing what is expected without challenging the system. Here, the collective often trumps the individual, and a culture of resentment against those above becomes prevalent. This dynamic can stifle personal growth and the flourishing of individual potential. Politics is another area where the master and slave morality comes into play. Populist movements often reflect slave morality in the sense that they channel a collective resentment against elites or those in power. The rhetoric is often one of the victimhood, depicting the common person as oppressed and the elites as corrupt or out of touch with reality. These movements, while powerful, well, they're often built on the idea of reactive, resentful morality, which focuses on what is wrong with the world rather than seeking the provocative ways to shape it. Meanwhile, systems which emphasize individual achievement, competition, and the recognition of talent align more closely with Nietzsche's master morality. You see, these systems reward those who excel, focusing on personal responsibility and effort rather than collective grievance. The emphasis here is on overcoming obstacles, transcending limitations, and creating new opportunities for oneself. Nietzsche challenges us, each one of us, to embody master morality in our own lives. He encourages us to affirm our strengths, take responsibility for our own lives, and transcend societal norms that may be limiting our potential. Instead of simply reacting to the world around us, whether it is reacting to societal pressures, past traumas, or the expectations of others, Nietzsche calls us to create and embrace our own values. This can be a difficult challenge, of course, as it requires us to confront our fears, even our doubts, but by doing so, we transcend to the reactive, from the reactive to the creative, from the reactive mindset towards a life where we are the creators of our meaning. Ask yourself this question: are your values rooted in creation or recreation? Are you shaping the world according to your own vision, or are you simply responding to what others have laid out for you? Are you affirming life's potential, or are you caught in a cycle of resentment? Nietzsche's framework invites us to reflect deeply on these questions and challenge ourselves to move beyond the constraints of slave morality toward a life of master and creation. And by exploring these modern parallels of master and slave morality, we see how relevant Nietzsche's philosophy remains today. It urges us to reflect on how we can break free from reactive, resentful patterns and step into a life where we can create and affirm our highest potential. By stepping into the creative and affirming mindset, we finally begin to embody what Nietzsche envisioned as the path to human greatness, the ability to rise above societal norms and live authentically. You see, this journey isn't about rejecting all traditions or past influences. Rather, it is about reinterpreting them in ways that align with our unique potential. The episode of God is Dead, the recreation of values, it's basically what we're doing. And in doing so, we move closer to the ideal of the Übermensch, the individual who thrives not by reacting to the world, but by shaping it according to their own vision. Nietzsche's philosophy challenges us to take this transformative step, urging us to see life not as a series of constraints, but as an open canvas for creativity, for strength, and for profound self-discovery. That's all for today's episode of Philosophizing with a Hammer. As we explore the tension between the master and slave, I encourage you to reflect on your own life. Are you creating your own values, or are you simply reacting to the world around you? If this episode sparked something in you, share it with someone who cares, someone who might find it meaningful, and don't forget to leave a review to help others discover the show. Until next time, signing off.